how do we find an equation for a sinusoidal graph that we have been given? Sinusoidal meaning sine or cosine. Well, here's a graph that I've been given, and I'm going to have to try and figure out what the equation is. The first thing I'm going to do is, I know that graphs like this, the amplitude means it's going above a center line the same distance that it's going below a center line. These graphs are remarkably symmetrical. So what I want to find in this graph here is where would be my center line. It's clearly not the x-axis, because the x-axis is just cutting a couple of things off at the bottom. So this graph of whatever it is has been lifted up. And I can look at it and I can kind of see that that I have a line going right about here that is cutting this graph right down the center. And that line is at 2. So that is telling me that whatever the equation of this graph is, it's probably going to have a k of plus 2. Because on the parent function of both sine and cosine, the center line is the x-axis. It's y equals 0. But this graph has been lifted up by 2. So I'm pretty sure I'm going to have a plus 2. Now, if I pretended in my mind that this now was like the x-axis, well, I know that cosine graphs don't start at 0, 0. The sine graph cuts through 0, 0. Where x is equal to 0, the sine is equal to 0. Where x is equal to 0, the cosine is equal to 1. So this looks like, since I have a new center line, this new red piece right there, which is kind of like my surrogate x-axis, this is going to be some kind of a sine graph, although it's looking a little bit weird because it starts by going down instead of going up like a sine graph usually does. That's going to indicate to me something about the positive or negative of it. But let's just say I can tell that since it's going through my 0, 0 point, so to speak, my center line 0 point, this is going to be some kind of a sine graph. Now, it doesn't have an amplitude of 1. It's going up above my center line much farther than 1, and it's going down below my center line much farther than 1. And then I can kind of count and see it's going 1, 2, 3 above my center line, and it's going 1, 2, 3 below my center line, which is telling me that the amplitude is going to be 3. And another way to find that out is find out, well, what is the maximum point? The maximum point is right here at 5. And what is the minimum point? The minimum point is right here at -1. So if I take the maximum point and I subtract the minimum point, which is -1, so I'm subtracting -1, that is equal to 6, and then you divide it by 2, that will give you the amplitude of 3. So that's another way to find the amplitude. If you don't want to count, or if it's easier to do it this way, you take the maximum point, subtract the minimum point, and then divide by 2. So now I have my amplitude. Let's write over here. I have A sine parentheses omega x plus k. We haven't dealt with shifts yet, left and right, so we're just going to leave the h out. So I've got my A and I've got my k. I don't know what my omega is. I need to figure out what is the period of this graph. Well, the period, remember, is the distance in which it takes to do a complete cycle. So I'm going to look here. Here's the top, and then it goes all the way down and back up here. So that's a complete cycle, and I'm going to count it. That's looks like it's right about in the middle of some numbers there. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Well, that could be my period. What about from bottom to bottom? It should be the same. Let's just double check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's good too. And it might even be easier if I look to see where does it cut my center line. And it's going to cut my center line not just the two places, but one in the middle, because as you recall, the sine graph as well as the cosine graph, they both go up and down and then back up. So between this point here and this point here, so I'm going to mark it this point here and this point here, it's easy to see I have 3, 6. So my period here is 6. So period is equal to 6. Well, I also know that the period of the graph is equal to 2. That did come out very well. Let's see if we can erase that 2. Period is equal to 2 pi divided by omega. So that's telling me that 6, which is the period that I've counted, is equal to 2 pi divided by omega. 6 omega is equal to 2 pi. Divide both sides by 6. And I get omega is equal to pi over 3. So now I've got 3 sine pi over 3x plus 2. And the only thing I need to do left is to realize that this sine graph is upside down. It's been flipped. So my formula, my equation is minus 3 sine pi over 3x plus 2. And let's just check it out. Sure enough, that's how we find the formula from a graph. So if I was just to list out the steps, let me see if I can't just type this somewhere here. My first step would be to find the center line, which gives me k. Second step would be to determine the amplitude, which gives me A. Actually, maybe even once I find the center line, I think probably my second step would be to decide if sine or cosine, and account for possible negative values. Then I determine the amplitude, which gives me A, determine the period, and calculate omega. Then I have my formula, my equation.